So yeah, so this is definitely my favorite topic. So I can't wait how Steve will deliver on that. And I'm gonna give the voice to Steve, to the real magician.
Okay, well, thank you, Greg. And if ever we need any magic, we need some magic this evening. I deliberately saved this subject for last because, without question, it's the most challenging for all of us to get our heads around. And it's pretty challenging for me to describe how my head works in a way that yours might resonate with as well. But we are nothing if not resilient. So we're going to take that as a positive challenge, knowing that there are invisible giants who are waiting to come in on our side to help us through. That's what another word for infinite intelligence. This is the last in the series of lockdown webinars. I've had fun. I hope you have. Some of you have been there for every show, and Johnny is missing it already. But as I spoke to him shortly before the program, I will carry on. I won't carry on in this kind of in this kind of format, but let me save those comments for later. But put in your mind, hypnotically speaking, if anything, what would you like to see in any future shows? And we'll take it from there. So we've been on this journey. We started talking about fear, and we've more or less agreed that fear is usually anxiety that gets out of place. And hopefully none of us are as fearful as perhaps we were 8 weeks ago, or however long it was. It seems forever. We're in time distortion now in lockdown. And we've moved our conversation on to the 4 monster stress busters of havening, the psychosensory technique where we stroke our arms. We talked about heart math, the breathing and meditation technique. We talked about healing in the widest sense. And the last show was about hypnosis. And all of these ways, all of these techniques are really useful. I've addressed them all in a very superficial way, but even in such a shallow approach, I think we've seen that they can be very helpful in bringing down our stress levels. And anything that brings down our stress levels increases the power of our thinking, boosts our immune system, keeps our blood pressure normal, and protects us to some extent from all of those nasty diseases out there, heart disease and strokes and all that kind of stuff. But they do have their limitations, these techniques, as do all therapeutic techniques, because they are basically band-aids. They take care of the problem that's in front of our eyes to a greater or lesser extent, but generally don't do too much at the level underneath that. Although I said that with a slight hesitation, because there's no question that hypnosis used in the right sort of way, or in the right sort of way for that particular person, can connect very powerfully to the unconscious. And all the best thoughts that we have, without question, come from our unconscious mind. And that's a message that I'll repeat time and time again, which causes us a bit of a problem, because the unconscious mind is where we don't spend very much time. We prefer, by choice and as victim of circumstances, to focus on our conscious mind. It's much easier. It's what we're aware of by definition. And there's a part of that conscious mind that I call ego, or in fact, we can say, broadly speaking, the ego is the conscious mind. And the phrase that I use about ego is that ego is no amigo. And I see this all the time in the people that I meet, the people that are clients, and the meetings that I go to. And the problem manifests itself particularly clearly in performance. And I call myself an elite performance coach, and I do work with some elite performers. And for every elite performer who has reached his or her level at the top of their game, or whatever they do, there's probably 5 who haven't come anywhere near that. All equally talented, sometimes even more so, but something gets in the way. And a typical conversation will be, I know I'm really good at what I do. I don't want to be boastful or anything like that, but I know when I look around that there aren't many people who are better than what I do. But you put me in front of an audience, put me in front of a camera, put me in front of a microphone, even put me in front of my relatives, my coach, and I'm not the same person. I'm average at best. Now, what has taken their ability away? They still have that ability, but it's their ego. Because unfortunately, ego is really good at the kind of things we don't want it to be good at. It's great at controlling stuff that doesn't need to be controlled by little ego. It's good at being very critical. It never runs out of reasons why we're pretty useless at the things that we do and why we'll never be good at this, that, or the other. And when we start to think for ourselves, which of course we're responding to those increasingly frantic signals from our unconscious mind, please do something a bit different. As soon as we start to have our own ideas, ego will come in and say, just remember the last time you tried to do something like this. So that's why books don't get published. It's why sports people don't win their majors. It's why great musicians don't produce their works. It's why artists don't do all the kind of stuff that they want to do. And it's all of us. That's the sad thing. You don't have to be an elite performer to suffer from our ego. So what can we do about it? Really that's where infinite intelligence comes into it. And I'm going to give you a little definition of, I've given you a few in the show notes as we've been going through the weeks, but this is maybe my favorite one. And it's from Nobel Prize winner, and some people say the best scientist of all time, Thomas Edison. I know this world is ruled by infinite intelligence. Everything that surrounds us, everything that exists, proves that there are infinite laws behind it. There can be no denying this fact. It's mathematical in its precision. And other people who've said much the same thing in alphabetical order, as they say. Buddha, Leonardo da Vinci, Thomas Edison I've mentioned, Einstein, Carl Jung, we're going to talk about him a little later, James Maxwell, Isaac Newton, Wolfgang Pauli, we're going to talk about him a little later, George Bernard Shaw, most philosophers, and all of the religions that I have some knowledge about, not that I have any great knowledge about any of those things really, but they're basically recurring messages throughout history. So what on earth, how can we unravel this infinite intelligence? Now, it doesn't mean to say that we're going to be infinite. Even if we can get a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction more than we have at the moment, this is what can make all the difference to our performance. And perhaps more importantly than performance is the way we view life and the way we don't suffer the kind of stress and anxieties that are so common now, particularly in the Western world. Now, when people do perform at their very top level, they always talk about the same kind of things. They say, I really don't know what was different today. I didn't feel any different. But when I started, it seemed like I got out of my own way. I just let go of stuff. It even felt as if somebody else was swinging the tennis racket, the golf club, or even saying the words in their speech or whatever it was that they're doing. So something they were able to latch onto something that would quieten the ego and allow their true unconscious capabilities come through. Generally speaking, just as I'd forgotten one other thing, with the things that get in the way from Mr. and Mrs. Amigo, is perfectionism. Perfectionism is part of the problem, because anything like that, perfectionism in other people around us or in ourselves, all adds to performance pressure, and performance pressure takes away performance. Even you'll find many coaches who will say the opposite. They'll say you've got to be under pressure, you've got to have motivation, you've got to build yourself up. They might be right, but I don't think they are. I have a different view on that. Generally speaking, when something stares us in our face, and we've ignored it all of our life. It takes something pretty seismic to shake us out of our distorted view of reality. And this happened to me about 3 or 4 years ago. And forgive me if you've heard me say this story before, because I do talk about it very openly. And it's when the green lights came on for me. It was the flashbulb moment. Perhaps you could say it was the synchronicity, and I'm going to come on to that later as well. And I was giving a talk at the Havening International Conference. Havening had only been around really for 2 or 3 years, and I was one of the first people involved in it, and I was a keynote speaker. And with my friend and colleague and the person who actually introduced me to Havening, Paul McKenna. And Ron Rudin, who was the creator of this technique, he was there as well. And there were a lot of very important people in the room. So I wanted to do my best, but even if there are only 6 people in the room round at the local community centre, it wouldn't make any difference, because whatever I do, if I think it's important, I will try to do my best. And so this was no different, really. The thing that was different, that really worried me, because I didn't know where it was coming from, that as I was sitting in the audience just about 15 minutes before I was supposed to go on stage, I started to feel ill. And I didn't know what it was. I mean, my first thought was, well, Steve, you've talked about it long enough. You've got performance anxiety. But maybe I did. But I would have been a bit surprised, because I'm used to speaking, and I've spoken all over the world. I've lost count of how many times I've spoken in front of groups. So whilst I don't know anybody who doesn't get a few little butterflies of excitement, I don't think that I was being crippled by performance anxiety. So I thought perhaps I was ill, I'd got a virus or something. Perhaps I thought I was going to throw up or something. None of these thoughts were very helpful when I knew I was going to be standing on that stage in 10 minutes and still counting down. Now, if I'd been able to get out and go for a walk around outside, I would have done all the things that I've told you about, and I'm quite sure that I soon started to feel a bit better. But that wasn't an option. So with about 2 minutes to go, I recalled a conversation I'd had with a lady in the audience earlier in the day. I was in the afternoon, and this was in the morning at coffee break. And she told me this thing that I'd heard of before, but not very much, hadn't made much of it. And it was called the 3 Principles. She said, you've got to read this book. And, she meant well, but I've given up with reading. If I read, I wouldn't get anything done if I read all the books that people say that I should read. And I'm sure it's a great book, but I didn't read it. So I said, well, just come on, give me one paragraph. And she said, well, it's all about how, people have thoughts that don't really matter. And it's about the power of big mind, unconscious mind, stuff like that. Well, that didn't make any sense to me at all. I said, oh, that sounds very interesting. So anyway, that conversation came back into my head 2 minutes to go. And I thought, well, I wonder if this has something to do with a subject that I do know about, which is Carl Jung's view of the collective unconscious. So I quickly Googled this 3 Principles thing, and it looked like it might be a similar kind of thing. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go with what I know. So I'm just going to say, honestly, to myself, Steve, you're in no shape to get on that stage and do justice to what you're supposed to be talking about today. So I'm going to trust the collective unconscious is going to tap into me and use me in some way so that at least I can stumble through it to some extent. So I got on stage, and as soon as I started talking, that's exactly what happened. It was a very bizarre, almost surreal, almost schizophrenic experience, because when I was speaking, there were big speakers on either side of me, and it felt to me as if somebody else was speaking. And I really wasn't having to do anything. I could do what I normally do when I talk to people, is I could scan the room and look around and read the body language and interact in those small ways that gives me an idea of whether I'm on track or off track or whether I need to go back. All of those things are important to a speaker. And I was told afterwards that I'd done pretty well. And I hope that those comments were right, but I felt that they were. And the reason that I did was because I got rid of ego. And And so I guess you could say, in a simple sense, I was allowing my unconscious mind, which is massively more powerful, to guide me, at least. So later in the show tonight, I'll go more into what that could mean. So that's how it strikes us. So the reason I tell you this story is hopefully to offer you a little encouragement, and hopefully for you to find some of these thoughts, the easy way rather than the hard way. This thing creeps up on you. This is why it's such a very difficult and complex subject to discuss. And it can only be, well, what people have told me, and I'm sure they're right, is that it can only really be taught in metaphor. Because the unconscious, we're not talking to conscious mind. Logical, rational, out the window, won't do any good. We're talking to the deep parts of the reptile brain. We're talking to the home of intuition. And we're talking to the part of the brain that doesn't really value words that much. Words are artificial constructs. What the unconscious mind deals in is emotion, because emotions have a much wider arc than words on their own. I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask for questions and comments in a moment. So this is the kind of the final little thing that I'm going to say to give you, prompt you if there is anything you want to ask about or share. And I was making a major speech. In fact, it probably the most important speech in my life. It was unpaid. In fact, I had to spend quite a lot of money to be there, from what I remember. I would like to say it's a distant memory, but it's not very distant. I was giving the father's speech at my daughter's wedding, and talk about performance pressure. It was made very clear to me the kind of things that I would say, and particularly the kind of things that I wouldn't say. My daughter should know me by now that I'm not good at keeping to script, and I didn't, but I seemed to get away with it. And I had to follow the plan. There is a protocol of the subjects you have to touch. And one of them was, you're supposed to give some words of wisdom from your knowledge of marriage. Well, I was pretty honest in my talk. I said, the truth is that I don't think very much about these things. I don't think very much about marriage. But I guess what I do know is I know about marriage. I know what it is to be married. And knowing comes from a different part of the brain to the thinking bits. And as a species, we think too much and we don't know enough. We know hardly anything. So there we are. I'm leaving that one hanging. You'll probably crack that one at about 3 o'clock this morning, but resist the temptation to phone me and let me know what you came up with then. But now you have the opportunity to say whatever you want. Stunned faces.
I love this topic. It's my favorite topic. And I want to know what else you said. You cannot leave us hanging there.
Do you know, I have to. If you knew what I'd said, you would never believe it. It would have to be a private conversation. Even in Australia, by Australian standards, I think it's fair to say that I pushed the envelope. So that's for another day.
I shall ask Caroline.
She'll tell you, I'm sure.
I hope so.
You will be sworn to secrecy.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm really happy to have taken part tonight, because my question was going to be about how to bring non-duality into the havening world. And of course, you've mentioned the 3 Ps, so that was a perfect example of the unconscious collective coming into play for me, because I haven't said anything, but it's just come through. So I've had the answer to my questions. without having to ask them. So thank you.
Well, that's the way questions are. That's why questions are so wonderful. People use far more of their brain when they ask a question than when they listen to an answer. And I'll come on to that at the end when we have a think about what might come next. But nevertheless, even though the question was answered, I liked what you said. And this word duality, am I right that that's a 3 principles word?
Well, 3 principles, yeah. I mean, I've been looking at the connections between spirituality, havening, and different forms of alternative healthcare, let's say, mental health care, well-being, approaches to well-being. And for myself, I've been exploring that gap that we've talked about before, the split, what happens in that gap where we remove where we allow the ego, just leave it to one side and go into that space where we don't worry about what we're saying. And so the 3 Ps and non-duality is something that I've been exploring around. But you mentioned questions, and for me, very often, one of the difficulties is with people setting themselves up as gurus or teachers. And at that point, I find that they stop asking questions. And that I find that worrying, as somebody that doesn't like to call themselves a teacher, but likes to share and always ask questions. And I just wondered, well, yeah, I suppose non-duality, duality. I think most of us in the modern world, the Western world, are living in a dual sort of mode of life, way of living.
We are. And getting back to the knowing and thinking, the things that we think are true are usually not. So that tells us we're basically living in an illusion. And the things that we know that we think couldn't possibly be true very often are. So if that hasn't confused you, I don't know what will. But just going back to this duality thing and ego, there's another word that people use, and I think it's a good word. I can't think of a better word, and that's concessions. I mean, if I was really talking about the subjects that I wanted to talk about, I'd be talking about infinite intelligence the whole time, but I wouldn't have anybody to talk with or to share a discussion with. So as a therapist, the techniques that I've talked about, which are only 4 of the ones that I use, but they're, in my opinion, the most useful, they are concessions. We would be able to achieve all that we achieve and maybe even more if we didn't even touch those concessions. But I know from my experience and from talking to other people that we are so much in our own head, particularly now, particularly in our cultures, we are so in our own head that there would not be a chance of even contemplating the possibility of something deeper. So we make a concession which loosens people up a little bit. That's why I think in earlier talks I talked about these are portals, these are entry points to something deeper. Now, on the subject of something deeper, then getting more into the meat of infinite intelligence, well, perhaps before I said that, Andrea, what I would say is I don't consider myself a guru either, by the way. The last thing I like to be doing is lecturing people. I much prefer conversations and discussions. And that's why, our conversation about what happens next at the end of this show is going to be important, because I don't want to give any more lectures, basically. People have tapped into this greater thing, whatever it's called. I mentioned religion already. I mean, and there are plenty of people who do a really good job of explaining that to people who have their questions and want to know more. Biology can explain some of this infinite intelligence. And that I believe, would be Einstein's route. Because when he was asked about his religion, I mean, he was of Jewish culture and very religious, but he was excommunicated because they didn't like his views. So when he was challenged, you know, well, like, what is your religion? He would say, let's just say that I believe in Spinoza's view of God. Now, Baruch Spinoza, was a Portuguese philosopher who was an emigre to Holland because he himself was Jewish and had to move country, and that whatever pogrom was going on at that point. And funnily enough, that I didn't mean to do that as a segue, but it is a segue, because I'm going to read something to you, which is a paragraph that resonates very strongly with me. And it's an extract from Carl Jung's address on the first time he presented his views on the collective unconscious to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, which is probably about less than 3 miles, as the styling would fly, from where I am right now, right next to St. Paul's Cathedral. And I think it's the centre of London. I think it's part of the oldest part of London, and certainly dig underneath all the ruins, all the building that's going on, they always are coming across old churches, old temples, and underneath the temples there's old Druid temples, and you name it. Anyway, it's a very, very energetic part of London, which is why I like spending time there. Anyway, that's where Carl Jung was in October 1936. He'd been thinking about the collective unconscious for probably 30 years or so, but it had taken him that long before he felt prepared to say, to speak publicly, knowing that he would encounter a lot of controversy and resistance. And this was the year, I believe, my memory serves me right, that Adolf Hitler received the Times Man of the Year award, because in 1936, it wasn't widely known what was going on in Germany at that time. All the commentators knew was that Germany was massively rebuilding its economy and things like that. Anyway, actually, I've got something handwritten in front of this. I'm going to read this as well. This is a bit of Shakespeare. We really are hitting all the buttons this evening. You can tell it's the last show of the series. Here we go. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and entrances, and one man, brackets, and woman, in his time, her time, plays many parts. We play many parts in our life, and the reason why I wrote that down on this typed quote from Jung is because, in a way, that describes the archetypes, and Jung uses the word archetype in this paragraph. Here he goes. There is no lunacy people under the domination of an archetype will not fall prey to. If 30 years ago anyone had dared to predict that our psychological development was tending towards a revival of the medieval persecution of the Jews, that Europe would again tremble before the Roman fasces, that's their large pole, and the tramp of legions, that people would once more give the Roman salute, as 2,000 years ago, and that instead of the Christian cross, an archaic swastika would lure onwards millions of warriors ready for death, why, that man would have been hooted out as a mystical fool. And I kind of got goosebumps reading that, because I think he's absolutely right. So he predicted what was going on at least 3 years before most other people. But the scary thing from the psychological point of view here is that this is archetypal reptile behavior. It means that it means that this veneer of civilization that we talk about is a very thin one. And back to Einstein, the amount of free will that we have is somewhat limited. So what we know now, which makes, I guess, Jung's view of the collective unconscious a little more scientific, is we have a much greater knowledge of genetics and inheritance and chromosomes and genes. And so now we do know that our gene pool is far from pure. There are genes that we've inherited from different species of close relatives. There are people who still have Neanderthal genes. And certainly in terms of evolution, when we look at anatomy, we can see the evolutionary development that's taken us to where we are now. So in that way, it's not so surprising that there should be what I think Freud called archaic remnants. So this is no easier, really, to get your head around the collective unconscious than it is in infinite intelligence. But it does explain quite a lot. I used to use the word luck very loosely, and there are many synonyms for the word luck, and they include words like serendipity, coincidence, synchronicity. And it came as a surprise to me when I found out that this word synchronicity, which chimes with my views of bioresonance, that this word synchronicity was coined by Carl Jung. And he said a synchronicity is when there appears to be no connection between two events, and yet there is. And there's no logical explanation for it. Einstein would be a guest at the dinner table with Jung on occasions, and they would have these kind of discussions. And Einstein certainly couldn't get had major objections to synchronicity. And this is what he called famously, this is the spooky action at a distance. Well, if he'd be alive now, he would see things differently, because he's very famous for the theory of relativity, which is still, as far as we know, it's a fact. I know what's factual is always problematic, but in science, I don't think there are many people who disagree with the theory of relativity. But around about that time, there was the quantum theory was being developed, and that equally cannot be proven wrong. It's accepted as a valid theory. But one argues against the other. If one's right, the other has to be wrong, and vice versa. And that's what the greatest scientists are still working on to this day, on what is the relationship between relativity and quantum theory. And I mentioned the name Wolfgang Pauli because he was a guest at Jung's dinner table as well. And he was far more open to these views. And whilst he was developing his quantum theory and winning Nobel Prizes for it, he was working with Jung on looking for the basis of synchronicity. And of course, we still don't know. The explanation that is given by quantum physicists these days is they talk about string theory. And a lady, Cambridge professor, was on television explaining it. And she said, the easiest way I can explain it, it's like a sliced loaf of bread. And on every slice, there are different physical rules that govern the behaviors. So if you've got 40 slices in a life, you've got 40 different dimensions. And now people are saying, well, there's thousands of dimensions. So impossible to get our heads around that one. And what they say about string theory is, it's crazy, it doesn't make any kind of sense. But with all the experiments we do, at the end of the day, it's the only show in town that's left standing. So we all, I think, know about synchronicities. We've all had them in our life. Jung called these a falling together in time. And he also said, synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. We've talked about our eyes in previous shows. We've even talked about our metaphorical third eye. We've talked a lot about the deeper layers of our brain, particularly the reptile brain. And we've talked a lot about intuition, because intuition is the thing that gives us a nudge. And that's, I think, when we become aware of synchronicities, because you will all have synchronicities in your life, and I'm certain that all of us can have more, because another thing that Jung said was that synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. And if you're caught up in your head, the overthinking, the egomania, all of the rest of it, you won't see these things. You have to have a quiet mind. And these techniques we talked about, havening, heart math, healing, hypnosis, and many others, those concessions, they allow us to enter that deeper part of our mind and listen to our intuition. And if we take this at a deeper level, which is what I've tried to do, it changes the way we prepare for life and the things we have to do. With the exception of these webinars, which are a bit different, I generally prepare very little now for anything. I can have a very important business meeting. I can have a very important meeting with a client. And I now firmly believe that the less preparation I do, the better things will be. Because then I haven't boxed myself in. With no preparation, the world is a world full of possibilities. Once you start planning, that arc gets narrowed down. And it takes courage to do that. It takes a lot of courage. And the most courage it takes is the first time you do this. But I put out this challenge to you, give it a go and try it. A friend of mine's a TV presenter who's on for several hours a week in a pretty high pressure job. And I said to him, why don't you try it? And he said, never, 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 never in a million years. You must be joking. You don't know what's going on when I'm in front of all of those boxes. I said, well, I know a bit. And he said, no, not going to do it. But I could see I'd planted a little worm there. And 6 months later, I had a text. He'd been doing an outside broadcast and he'd done it. Now, I didn't say he's done no preparation, because of course there are some things technical stuff you have to have prepared for. But the spontaneous bits, which often are not as spontaneous as they are made to look, he was living in the moment. And he said the funny thing was everything went so much better. He said I had so much better interaction with all the people on the crew, all the people I was interviewing. It was so much easier. So that's a challenge. See how it goes. It's exciting to see. And I'm pretty sure you won't be disappointed. But as my friend did, he chose a relatively less important event to do it for the first time. So I guess as a health warning, I better suggest that you pick a little popcorn stand thing first. Don't choose that for the major business proposition you're going to make. So infinite intelligence, it's there just like the synchronicity. You have to be open to it, and you have to find a concession. You have to find some way of calming down that ego. And that can take a long time, or it can take a quick time. And even if you only do it a little can make an enormous difference. It makes an enormous difference to stress levels. And we've talked about the dangers of stress many, many times. But most of the things that we stress about and we worry about are future events. Well, if you could take 90% of that away, it gives you a lot more time to enjoy the good things in life in the moment. So I think this is a time for questions again, a time for questions and comments. Who's going to go first?
Johnny wanted to ask a question in the previous question time, so go ahead, Johnny.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that you're so right. I think back at the last 5 years, all the mistakes that I've made, there's been a guide the whole time, but that inner voice, I can do it different, it'll be okay. It was just like you said, the ego. And I also believe that these, like the unconscious mind, can speak to us through another person. It's a warning sign, but if we're not in a good place to listen to it. And also there's that thing about being impatient and wanting it to be now and right, where you've got to maybe take a step back, and like you said, if you're in a better place, calmer, you can see these warning signs. And I wish I'd only listened to all of them, but there you go, you're so right.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Johnny. And you're really echoing what I said. We generally only learn these things the hard way. And you know, I obviously know a little bit about your background, and you've had these challenges for sure. But you've demonstrated resilience, and you come out the other side. And I don't imagine you would argue with me too much if I were to say, you know, you're a different person in many ways, and you're using your experiences to work with others as well, which is wonderful.
Thank you, and thanks to you for teaching me a lot. So,
I don't teach anybody anything, John. As I said before, I wouldn't know how to, even if I wanted to.
I've learned a lot then. Maybe that's a better way of putting it.
What you've learned from is your own inner resources, and you've allowed those dots to join themselves up, I guess.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, Nitas has a question as well.
Okay, Nita.
Sorry, I'm having IT issues as normal. Really enjoyed these sessions, Stephen. You're such a humble gentleman, and as Johnny said, he's learnt lots from you, and I've gained so much from you in these last 6 weeks. So very grateful for that. My question was, how do you know when your ego has gone, please? How would I know that I'm coming from a deeper, unconscious, joined up place with the universe, and I've got rid of the ego? What would the signs be for that?
The signs are going to be a little bit different for everybody. I think it's the Buddhists who say that you've awakened. You will feel a load go off your shoulders. You will find that you sleep better. Definitely less stress. You'll get more things done in less time. And you'll find the funny thing, I don't know whether this is an example of a synchronicity, you'll find that, you know, when you're preparing a project and you don't know really where to start, once you make a start, sometimes 80% of the things will get solved by other events or other people. And that's probably, you know, may explain why things get done quicker. We don't have to do the heavy lifting. It's not meant to be like that. So I have a feeling that you're there already, frankly, but you know, there's no limit to how much further we can go with this.
Yeah, thank you for that. So is it like being in the flow, and it just sort of runs itself in a way?
That's exactly what it is. Being in the flow, being in the zone. Most of us only have a few experiences in our whole life of being in real flow. But when one starts to get rid of ego, we can have these experiences every day.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, talking about synchronicity, I heard somebody talking recently and talking about living in, being in the now and worrying and overthinking in the head, that knew that was going along a path and there was an important decision to make that was coming up, and which was the right path to take. And he spent many hours agonizing it, thinking it, and how will he know, and all the rest of it, and meditated about it and worried about it and didn't sleep about it. And when he got there was this big sign saying, go this way.
There you go.
About letting go.
Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. It was literally right in front of them. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
Ludwig, I see. Yeah, thanks, Sue. Ludwig wants to make a comment. Of course you can. Yes.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for the sessions. I really enjoy that. And what I wanted to ask you, I do the 12-week program of the Artist Way, and there's a tool, Morning Pages. It's like a stream of thoughts, you know, just write everything what comes. How you find it as a tool to go through the unconscious?
Can you just tell me what you do again? I'm sorry to ask you that question. I just got actually distracted by a comment underneath.
Yeah, okay. The Morning Pages, this is the name of the tool, and this Morning Pages is just after I woke up. I just have to start to fill in the 3 pages. Just what I feel, what I think, everything. Don't and I cannot judge that. You know, it's just write everything. And what comes? I started to do this 4 weeks ago, and last week I wrote 3 novels, short novels. I was really surprised at it, and it was good. You know, I like that, and I believe this comes from unconscious. What do you think about it?
I believe it does as well. I think you've actually answered your own question. There's an expression that people use where they say writing is the doing part of thinking. Because when you start writing, I mean, I've written about 8 books or something, and I actually don't like writing. But once I've written the first paragraph, I mean, the gut feeling goes, you know, that sort of like, I really don't want to do this. And you start to get absorbed in what you're doing. And so if you know, when you wake up, you haven't really had a chance to overplan your day yet, you're still a bit groggy from sleep. And once you start writing and you write 3 pages, that is definitely going to be the doing part of the thinking. And the doing part of the thinking, what that means is you are connecting without doubt to your unconscious mind. And when you go back to that, you'll see those things. And it can be a bit frightening sometimes because you'll think, where did this come from? You know, how did I think of that? And that can often be the thing that can make a huge difference to whatever it is that you're dealing with. So that's a good technique. I'm not sure that I personally would have the self-discipline to do it every day. But you know, I probably do something similar in a different way. But yeah, I think it's good. And so please keep me informed with how you get on with that. Great,
Okay.
Thanks for sharing. Any other comments?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, the final thing that I wanted to say was, apart from, you know, thank you for staying with it, is that I'm happy to carry on doing these webinars, but in a different format. And that's really what I wanted you to think about. And you don't need to answer these questions now, but what I have in mind is to keep it pretty open, you know, like it could be, you know, ask Steve anything. Obviously, if you ask me how to be an accountant, I'm not going to be able to give you a very good answer, but if it's got anything to do with human behavior, personal development, and the mind, then I'm happy to share what I know and be maybe a catalyst for further discussions. So I guess I'm looking for a meeting that's a little more interactive. I mean, I think it's been great today because we have had more comments, but it can feel, if this was a live event, I wouldn't have any reservations at all because I can always engage with an audience. But even that brilliant as Zoom is, particularly in these unprecedented times, as they say, it still has its limitations. So that's really about as far as my thinking has gone. So on that note, let's wrap up for today. Thanks for being here. Greg, thanks for helping me with the preparations. and we will see what the next week brings, and hoping that those invisible giants are going to visit us and take some of the load off our backs. So until next time, stay well.